This is all happening as Passover is approaching, which means the city of Jerusalem is going to swell by about 200,000 to 300,000 people. Passover is a pilgrimage festival, which means that if you can, you would want to celebrate it in the holy city. So this has an interesting consequence because first off, it's Passover. So the people are celebrating and remembering when they were slaves in Egypt and God rescued them, which means that they are going to particularly be aware of the Roman occupying force. And this also then means that Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, is going to be on edge. He was known for having quite the temper anyway, but because it was Passover, and meaning that people are going to be very aware of their subjugation under Rome and very aware of the fact that God is interested in their suffering and wants to rescue them from it, well, it could create a violent crisis. So Pontius Pilate, as the time of Passover was approaching, would actually take up residence in the city itself, in Fortress Antonia, which looks over the temple complex. And he would bring extra soldiers just in case something happened. In other words, things were going to be a little tense if you were Roman. So it was said by the prophet Zechariah that when God's Messiah, his rescuer, was coming into the holy city, that he would ride on a donkey. It was going to be a symbol of peace, or at the very least a symbol of peace for those who belong to God, and maybe not quite so much peace for the enemies of God's people. So Jesus specifically picks a donkey, knowing that this kind of prophecy or these kinds of ideas are going to be on people's minds. I think he's deliberately ticking these boxes because he has this sense that he is fulfilling this vocation of Israel. Now, later Jewish writing would say that when Messiah comes, if he finds this generation to be worthy, he will come riding on the clouds, drawing from some very significant Old Testament imagery. And I want you to hold that thought because that's going to come up later. But if he found this generation to be unworthy, then he would approach Jerusalem riding on a donkey. Now, it's unclear if Jesus has this in mind. I mean, these rabbis were saying this quite a bit later than Jesus, but it seems like Jesus has this idea in mind because he talks about this crooked generation. He's clearly very frustrated with his people. I tend to think that this idea was being passed around as oral tradition. People speaking from one generation to another, passing these ideas around until they get written down much later. Now, the part about the branches, the people celebrating, waving around palm branches and saying Hosanna and such is kind of weird, but not for the reason you might think. People would do this during the Feast of Sukkot, which happens around the fall. It's a harvest festival. And they would wave their palm branches. A palm branch in that case would be called a lulav, and they would recite the Psalms. One of them in particular, Psalm 118, says, Lord, save us, Hosanna. So it seems like they're co-opting that tradition and imposing it on what Jesus is doing as he's riding into Jerusalem. They're proclaiming him as the one who's come to save. Now, it's only weird because it would be like taking a Christmas tradition and importing it into Easter because for whatever reason, this was a very special Easter or something like that. It may be weird, but it's not out of the ballpark. So then Jesus comes across a fig tree, and apparently he's hungry, and the fig tree doesn't have anything to eat, so he curses it. And I don't think that Jesus is hangry. He doesn't strike me as the type, like so hungry that you're just going to start cursing things because you're upset. I think this is a metaphor for what Jesus is finding, not just in his generation, but what he's finding in Jerusalem, and in particular the temple. that this tree didn't bear any fruit, just like his own people, and particularly the holy city of Jerusalem itself. Because right after this, he goes into the temple. And we're told that he goes and he stops people from being able to buy the things they need, and stops them from being able to change money. And I guess there's something about pigeons there or something like that. But don't miss the point. The point isn't that people are just overcharging on things and Jesus is upset about it. He calls the temple a den of robbers. That is heavy and significant. And it's also prophetic judgment. See, as it turns out, the temple became this center of economic predation. It was incredibly wealthy, and higher ranking priests, as a result, became incredibly wealthy. It seems like the temple had been holding and keeping track of debt records, which puts it in a certain position of power. The temple was being used as a bank, and we saw tons of money get passed through it in terms of temple taxes and tithes and that sort of thing. As it turns out, the priests were, I think, very good at skimming off the top. In any case, it had become an economic plague, especially if you were, like everybody else, incredibly poor. And so as Jesus enters the temple, he is offering a chance of repentance. He's saying, this is not the house of God. This is not what we had in mind. This is part of the problem. Like I said in a previous session, the economy was incredibly predatory for those who were poor. And if God's own house becomes part of that problem, then that's even worse. Now, if you noticed, the chief priests were particularly upset about Jesus' action. And this is certainly the final straw that breaks the camel's back in terms of getting Jesus executed, so he will stop bothering those in power. And I think the chief priests in particular are upset because he's calling them out. They're the ones that have the most to lose if Jesus really is the Messiah. But they're also the ones that are causing the problems to begin with. Now, as it turns out, if you call out the people who have the most power and have the most wealth for being part of the problem, and you are in fact correct, well, you're going to end up paying for it, as we're about to see.